Hello and welcome to another episode of Idioms of Normality, hosted by Traces.Dreams and Future Framed TV. I'm joined here today with Professor Allan Horwitz, who is Professor Emeritus at Rutgers University in the US. And he is probably the best positioned interviewee so far to answer the question, what is normal? Because he has written a book called What's Normal. Professor Horwitz, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, well, that's very good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, tell us, what brought you to write a book called What's Normal?
Well, I really started my career in sociology in the early 1970s. And really, right from the beginning, I studied mental illness and studied mental illness for really various aspects, usually of the social response to mental illness, for about 3 decades. And then that started to seem pretty limiting. And at the time, I was collaborating with a philosopher, Jerry Wakefield, who had developed a concept of harmful dysfunction that we used in two books, really. One about depression and when depression is normal and when it's disordered. One about anxiety and when anxiety is normal and when it's abnormal. And so I started thinking about how the harmful dysfunction analysis, which basically says in order to decide whether a mental illness is a disorder or just a socially devalued condition, you need to know two things. The first would be, is it a biological or psychological dysfunction? And by dysfunction, what I mean is some naturally selected mechanism is not acting the way that it's biologically designed to act. So, say depression without any reason to be depressed. No loss has happened in your life. Nothing is bad. That's just not the way humans are biologically designed to be. But somebody dies, you become depressed. Well, that's not a dysfunction because people are designed to grieve after somebody close to them dies. So a dysfunction is one necessary aspect, but not all dysfunctions are necessarily disorders because disorder also requires a cultural component. Does the culture define the dysfunction as something that's harmful? And only when cultural definitions sort of reinforce definitions of dysfunction do we have a true mental disorder. So that was the basic theme of the two books that I co-wrote with Jerry Wakefield. So I think, well, maybe there's a broader applicability. I'd been studying mental illness for a long, long time and wanted to sort of expand to other topics. So developed this aspect where perhaps if we think of normality in terms of two dimensions, the first would be, is it biologically natural or unnatural is the first dimension. The second dimension would be, is it culturally normal or abnormal? That gives a very oversimplified fourfold table of things can be both unnatural and abnormal, but there's the other three combinations as well. So what I then did was more intensively study particular phenomena that exemplify the different kinds of combinations of unnatural or natural or abnormal and normal. So, for example, and of course I know you're an anthropologist and many anthropologists would not agree with this, but I think as a archetype of something that's both unnatural and abnormal, I look at incest aversion, which is something that is, well, at least among people who share 50% or 25% of their genes is the incest taboo is universal. It doesn't change over time, and it is always seen as one of the most abhorrent things that two closely genetically related relatives can do. So that there's a congruence between how cultures define a phenomena and how I think natural selection also has designed people to avoid having intercourse with close relatives. So that is one kind of congruence. And on the total other opposite side, I'd studied before in the book The Loss of Sadness, which is grief. That is, grief, I think we're both biologically designed to grieve after someone close to us dies, but it's also, culturally expected. It's a normal phenomena. That is, that people, your mother dies and you don't feel anything. This is actually the case in a famous novel by Alfred Camus, where he feels nothing and he's sort of shunned, and it seems abnormal not to grieve. So I think incest diversion and grief are at both congruent, but congruent in two opposite ways.
So you looked at function and dysfunction, normal, abnormal, natural.
No, those are the two dimensions, but that then leads to four possibilities.
Could I draw it back to just the first one, which is the normal abnormal distinction? And I think here we can unpack a little bit more about the distinction between the biological and cultural dimensions that you talk of in your book. What is normal? What is normal? Let's start there.
To start with, normal is very much culturally diffused. That is, it is whatever a particular society or a particular group in society or a particular subculture defines as something that is either typical, that most people act in a certain way, the statistical definition, or probably a more adequate definition would be something that's seen as desirable. That is, it's value laden.
So normal is something
people ought to do.
Okay, normal is something that is seen as desirable by in-group members, however big that group may be.
Correct.
Okay. And then you're saying that there are reactions that we can have, or there are experiences that we can have that are not desirable within certain social contexts, but that there's a bleed over between biological functions and dysfunctions and what may be considered normal or abnormal within a social group.
Correct.
So what determines whether or not a biological mechanism or biological processes are operating in a healthy manner or in an unhealthy manner? What's the rubric for understanding biological function?
Yeah, and of course, the adequacy of a biological definition is highly variable according to what phenomena we're talking about. So, as I read the evidence, and I think this is some of the most interesting material, is fear mechanisms are, I think, perhaps the most developed mechanism that biologists have studied, say, one cell organisms. When there's a toxin in their environment, they, depending on the organism, either try and get away from the toxin, or if you have a shell, you sort of curl up into your shell. You move away from danger. It's perhaps the most embedded biological mechanism. And certainly this holds for all species, including human species.
It's an interesting comparison that you make, because I've even seen it in the laboratory where you can drop a toxic liquid and you'll see certain unicellular organisms will move away from toxins. Yes. And the reason I say it's an interesting comparison is because humans are multicellular organisms, and we have not just a singular reaction to a toxin in our environment, or if we see toxic fumes coming our way, the body is reacting in so many different ways. We've got the galvanic skin response, we've got the heart rate going faster, there's the fight or flight, some people might freeze. There's a raft of different functions that need to operate harmoniously together in order to react to that event. Can you talk a little bit about the complexity of human reactions, or the complexity of what would be considered a healthy function for a human with an adverse event in their surrounds?
Yeah, this is why I think, in some ways, at least to me, the chapter in my book on courage and cowardice is perhaps the most interesting one, because for centuries, perhaps the most desirable social trait for men was to be courageous in battle. And of course, humans are designed to be cowards, and just the opposite. And of course, cowardice then is the most despicable characteristic that a soldier can display. So here you have cultural values and biological functioning work in exactly the opposite kinds of ways. What's biologically natural is cowardice. It's scorned by cultural values, and biological courage, well, which there really isn't such a thing as biological courage, maybe foolhardiness, but that courage is just highly esteemed. So armies have to go to tremendous lengths to try and instill a completely unnatural value into combatants.
I see your point here, because you use the words courage and cowardice. You don't use the words survival, for example. And sometimes being a coward, or what we might culturally label a coward,
Yeah.
is actually an act of survival. It's
Oh, absolutely. And humans, like all other species, including our one-celled distant cousins, are really designed to be cowards. I mean,
Yeah.
that's how you survive.
But the interesting point that you're making here is, we socially conditioned each other in a way that at some point in time, when the woolly mammoth was coming at us, we turned around and picked up a spear.
Mhm.
And that became the cultural imperative.
Yeah, although spears were not perhaps the best defense against a woolly mammoth. I think
It was a
we
metaphor.
did much better once we had weapons that were could overcome the mammoth. So
that were appropriate
speed
for the
and
predator.
size and strength.
Yes. But the point being that, of course, that at some point humans started compelling each other to look after each other in the fight or flight situations, in a way where they banded together and started to fight back against a predator, or to band together and to fight prey that was bigger than themselves. And that cultural imperative kind of domesticated the fear response in our brains and in our bodies to become something other than it was biologically predisposed to become. That's an interesting point.
It takes a lot, but cultural norms can indeed become more important than biological imperatives. I think courage is perhaps the best example of that. And another, I think, example of very bad mismatch between biological normality and cultural normality is in the case of obesity. Seemingly very different than cowardice and courage, but that, again, humans were evolutionarily designed in an environment where calories were hard to come by. And not only were they hard to come by, but occasionally you might have killed that woolly mammoth. But if you did, you had to consume the mammoth immediately, because there really was no way to preserve it. I mean, there was no refrigeration at the time. So you not only ate as much as you could, but you ate as much as you could immediately when you got the food.
Yeah,
And so
before the other predators got there too. Yeah.
right. So biologically designed to consume as many calories as we can, up to a point, of course. So we have ravenous appetites. But in an highly unnatural food environment now, calories are everywhere. I mean, so it's very, very difficult to control natural desire to consume calories. And of course, fatness is socially shamed. I mean, so again, there's this real mismatch between what's socially desirable and what's biologically natural.
I find it so fascinating how we make these high calorie, carbohydrate rich foods so readily available in the marketplace. And then it's not necessarily the best culinary match for our bodies. And yet it's desirable. Marketing companies love it because they're going to get high sales because people want to eat it. But then we're shamed for overeating, or we're shamed because our body doesn't digest certain foods the same way other bodies digest them. Their metabolic rate might be lower, or for whatever reason. And then there's a whole other industry that's built on the back
Yes,
of fat
the
shaming,
diet industry. Historically, it was hard to get fat. Only quite wealthy people could afford to get fat.
And at that point in time, it was desirable if you could get fat.
Because it was associated with sort of the upper class. But now, I mean, you might say that thinness for females might be the equivalent of cowardice for males. I mean, that's something that is culturally undesirable, but that really goes against, I'm sorry, I meant courage for males and thinness for females would be both culturally desirable, but biologically unnatural.
So this is a distinction I really want to make sure that I get my head around, and hopefully that listeners can get their head around as well. The idea that something can be biologically normal or biologically abnormal, and the idea that, and it's a matrices that you're talking about here, and that something can be culturally normal or culturally abnormal. So I'm imagining a square box, and you've got biologically abnormal and culturally abnormal. There's a match between the abnormalities biologically and culturally. And then you've got another box that says, oh, yes, culturally normal and biologically normal. But there's these other categories where it's biologically abnormal and culturally normal, or biologically abnormal and culturally normal. So
Correct.
Biologically abnormal and culturally normal would be your courage example.
Yes, right.
And then biologically normal but culturally abnormal, what would be an example of that?
Would be obesity.
Right. I'm with you. Yeah, because the body is having a normal response to that calorie intake.
Right.
But culturally, the desirable norm is to be thin, fit, and healthy. Well, basically me at 20, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Sometimes I find these cultural norms are a bit ageist as well, and quite gendered and quite inflected by ableism. Can you tell me a bit more about cultural norms?
One aspect of the relationship of cultural norms to biological functioning is that basically biology doesn't care what happens to organisms when they can no longer reproduce. That once they are old to reproduce, well, then biology just doesn't care. And that might be behind some of what you say are, sort of the ageist norms that arise in societies. Although, I mean, there's lots of counterexamples to that as well. I mean, where elders are sort of held in very high esteem in many groups.
I mean, it is an interesting thing about human populations that we have such a long post-reproductive lifespan.
Right.
And it's a valid point that it's quite unusual for organisms to have a prolonged post-reproductive lifespan.
Right. And that for humans has only been the case really in the past century or so.
In terms of the incredible length of the post-reproductive lifespan, yeah. Because, I mean, I think as far back as 500,000 years, we certainly had care of the elders because we have fossil remains demonstrating that we were bandaging our elders and looking after them and bringing them with our groups. And of course, the grandmother hypothesis, which was saying that grandparents played such an instrumental role in raising upbringing, in the division of labor within a group. And I feel like there's a crossover here between your ideas of biological norms and cultural norms, that the biological abnormality of post-reproductive lifespan is influencing the cultural desirability for young bodies.
Yeah. I think it's the biological, I guess maybe a better word would be indifference to. I mean, biology isn't hostile to post reproductive people. It just doesn't care because they can no longer reproduce.
A subtle but important distinction, yes. So there are other cultural norms, though, that you would be encountering in your research, particularly in mental illness, that spiral in numerous directions. Because grief was one example where you're saying that people might feel depressed when there's no stimulus, then that's biologically and culturally abnormal. Is that correct?
Correct. And probably, I mean, what historically would have been called melancholia has been recognized since the earliest, Hippocratic writings in ancient Greece. I mean, that's one of the few types of mental illness that is pretty much universally recognized as such.
Do you think we should keep the word normal? Because it seems to create a little bit of confusion.
Well, it's almost impossible to get rid of. And we now have very common, the new normal. That is, something used to be normal, it's no longer normal, but we still call it normal. It's now a new state of normal. And it's just so embedded in our language. I just don't see how
It's
we're
very
going to
pervasive, isn't it? But
Yes.
when we're talking about things like the return to normal or going back to normal or the new normal,
Mhm.
we're not necessarily talking about a person, or we're talking about a state of affairs. And
Right.
the word normal bleeds into applications that are not necessarily about the individual, but are suddenly about a group's way of life.
Yeah, and there certainly is, and this is a fairly recent phenomena, a reaction against using something terms like normal, especially now we don't call people mentally disordered. We have neurodiversity, for example, that deaf people will oppose things like cochlear implants that allow them to hear because they see deaf culture as a highly desirable state. It's not abnormal to them. Certainly in sexuality might be the example where, well, what's normal sexuality now is sort of really in question. And certainly different people and different groups have totally different conceptions of what that involves. So that behaviorally, normal may be breaking down, but nevertheless, people still use it as a frame of reference. And probably always will.
So behaviorally, the word normal seems to be breaking down in terms of its applicability to in medical contexts or in very specific discussions about things like sexuality or other kinds of behaviors. And yet the word is persisting in society. Now, I find this fascinating because up until about 180 years ago, the word normal wasn't in our vocabulary, and yet it has been such a pervasive concept. It has invaded the languages of people all around the world. And I find it fascinating that we're all using the same word too. You can, the French, the Germans, the English, the Hispanics, even, you travel to Indonesia, they use the word normal. And in Vietnamese or Chinese or Japanese, you see compound words being created to refer to something akin to normal, simply because there was no concept for normal that was indigenous to these languages in the first place. So they had to create new words, new compound words. So how did this concept become so popular?
Well, there may even be some kind of a biological basis that is for the longest periods in humanity that people lived with others who were pretty much just like them. That they're shared the same customs, the same language, the same behaviors, that there was sort of no need for a concept of normality because it was just so taken for granted that those who weren't normal were in different groups that were generally enemies that you fought wars against, that were seen as dangerous. I mean, so they were just so truly abnormal as opposed to the in-group normality that there just wasn't a need to have a more specific definition of normality.
You're making me think that perhaps the recent history of globalization and
Yeah,
globalization
yeah.
over the last century and a little bit more, as cultural groups become more in contact with each other, this word normal is a useful way to describe us, and
Mhm.
the word abnormal is a useful way to describe them. And of course, in globalization, we see much more cultural encounters. And so perhaps the word normal travels with globalization because it provides a vocabulary for talking about difference.
No, I think that's absolutely true. And Charles Darwin, I think, wrote some of the most interesting kinds of things, when he was on his famous voyage on the Beagle going around South America. And he describes his encounters with the so-called natives there, where he knew sort of their customs were equivalent to his. I mean, he did not think his were superior to his, but nevertheless, he couldn't stop himself from being disgusted at what kinds of food they ate, how they went about eating them. So he was very understanding that there was no basis for his disgust, but he couldn't help himself from feeling it.
That's such an interesting observation because, often we are disgusted by the foods of other groups. Or I, for example, have been, in fact, I've got some cricket powder in, some insect protein in my coffee this morning. And,
I think I'll pass on drinking.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Like I'm testing myself. I'm seeing how I can consume food differently. But there is an initial reaction, and it's a visceral reaction. We culturally conditioned our bodies so that biological response is part of the natural patterning of my body's reaction when it sees something that it isn't accustomed to eating or hasn't seen someone eat before.
Right. There's very few. I mean, there's Asian food markets just out that say you see monkey brains, for example, on display. I mean, that most Westerners, certainly I include myself in this, wouldn't even want to look at such things, much less eat them. My God. But you're right. I mean, there's nothing that is biologically unnatural about eating that. I mean, they're great sources of protein. Perhaps they taste good. I'll never know. But it's disgusting to me.
And this goes back to me, in my mind, it goes back to a little bit about the courage or cowardice.
Yes.
The
Yeah, exactly.
cultural conditioning for courage has overridden the biological
Mhm.
predisposition for cowardice. And in a different way, though, because I think as a child, you're so open to trying putting everything in your mouth. And then at some point in time, these taboos entered into the way in which we consume food. And then we start recognizing the food that we are permitted to eat. And we start developing a visceral reaction to foods that we have become acclimatized to not eating.
Yeah. Although there does seem to be certain kinds of tastes that we're programmed to like, and salty, sugary, fatty kinds of foods are almost universally liked, but they can appear in so many different forms that, for example, monkey brains again. I mean, they may well taste salty or sweet or whatever. Still won't eat them, but
Yeah, fermented foods it's an interesting category to consider there, because I think almost every society in the world has developed a fermented food of some sort, whether it's yogurt or beer or fermented fish, which I can't imagine how bad that must smell. But somehow some groups have overcome their gag reflex to start consuming these foods that are maybe they're bitter, maybe they're not the sugary, fatty taste that we really strongly desire and very readily warm towards.
Yeah,
Um,
there's a very, very small number types of foods that are universally reviled. Feces would be one. And this is among humans. I mean, if you have a dog, you know, it's not, doesn't go across species, but that feces is one. And rotten food is another thing, that sort of the smell of rotting food is naturally aversive, so that all humans are sort of designed not to eat rotten food.
and it makes sense. I mean, you
Yeah,
know, if
yeah,
you smell something rotting, then the likelihood of it having bad bacteria is increased.
exactly.
The reason I'm finding this discussion fruitful is because it's making me wonder if the dichotomy between biological function and cultural function or cultural dynamics breaks down, given the way in which culture and biology are mutually impacting.
They're absolutely mutually impacted. I mean, even in the case of, say, incest, which at least I believe is biologically inborn, that, well, where's the line? And say first cousins, for example, there's huge variability across different groups on whether that counts as incest or not. I mean, can you marry a first cousin? And in certain societies, it's a positively valued form of marriage. So that sort of seems where the boundary breaks down at that level. But, and even there are historical exceptions to, say, brother sister incest, but they're very, very rare.
Yeah, the
I mean,
ancient Egyptian pharaohs come to
exactly.
mind. And
Yes.
allow me to ask the really basic question here. Why are incest taboos biologically natural? When I think about why incest is unfavorable, is because of, to my mind, it's because, well, there's a higher rate of genetic problems that can arise in the children. Is there another
Well, that's,
reason?
I think, the major reason is that genes for harmful or fatal disease can't be dominant genes. That is, they would just die out very quickly. So they have to be recessive genes. So it's much more likely that two closely related people will share two recessive genes. And if they mate, the recessive genes will become dominant and, you say, result in more deformities. So that interesting question, I think, is, well, how do people know who's related to them? Every decade or so, you read a story in the paper where two siblings, you know, separated at birth, come together, or now with in vitro fertilization, the possibility is, you know, much higher that two strangers, culture, who have never met each other, who don't know they're genetically related, do have probability of, you know, coming together. So there was a Finnish anthropologist, Edward Westermark,
Okay.
who really developed a very powerful hypothesis, I think, as well. People learn, in a sense, the incest taboo by who they're around between birth and age 3. That is, so whoever you are being raised with are people you're going to become sexually aversive to. Of course, this is in certain ways opposite to the Freudian hypothesis, that that's the age when you develop these strong love interests with. But I find Westermark's, they're quite compelling, and a number of empirical studies of, say, Israeli kibbutzim back when in the 1960s, when, say, children were raised communally and they weren't separated into nuclear families. They were all put together. And even though there were no cultural sanctions against them when they passed puberty, there was no cultural reason why they couldn't have intercourse with each other, but none of them did.
This is a very broad question, but you've spent a career looking at mental health, at social function, at cultural dynamics, and you've interrogated this concept of normality in regards to biological function and cultural dynamics. What kind of personal transformation has this brought to your personal understanding of normality and where you sit with normality in your own life?
Just from the way I was socialized in my graduate education in sociology in the 1970s, where biology was almost a curse word. Yeah, I mean, no one would have thought to that there's a biological dimension to human life, or to human social life at the
Within the
time.
social sciences. Yeah.
Within the social sciences, and particularly sociology and in anthropology, at least, there was a subfield of biological anthropology. There was not a subfield of biological sociology. And it's still quite uncommon for sociologists to look, although it's becoming more and more the case. But so to me, the most unusual thing about my own feelings is to realize how important biological functioning and natural selection is to human activity, which probably wouldn't surprise people in many fields, but just goes so against the way that say I was trained.
When we talk about natural selection on human populations, we have to be very nuanced about our understanding of that, seeming as the way in which cultural and industrial and agricultural inventions have buffered us to some degree from direct natural selection. Like, we're surviving so much more than we would have just a few centuries ago, thanks to things like medicine, thanks to things like agricultural production and industrial production. Do we have to understand natural selection in a very nuanced way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the concepts mentioned in the book that we haven't talked about is really the mismatch between how we were naturally selected over the course of millions of years into certain natural things that no longer have any use in modern environment. And say fears are one of the good examples, what people are afraid of now. So, for example, very high number of people say have snake phobias, even though they never really see snakes unless they're in a zoo, for example. But again, Darwin was provided a good example of this when he went to the zoo, determined to not be afraid of a snake that was behind sort of a glass partition where there couldn't possibly be any harm to him. But when the snake sort of jumped out at him and Darwin just leapt backward at the snake, it was really almost an inborn fear that he couldn't escape from, even though there were no snakes in England in the 19th century. I mean, it wasn't a rational fear by any means. Or even say a lot of people are afraid of heights, even though these days there's no good reason to be afraid of heights. And most people who have intense fears of heights didn't have, say, an experience of falling off a cliff or something. That it's more of an inborn fear, and many people won't fly because of their fear of heights, also combined with being in enclosed spaces where you can't get out. So fear of flying is another case of mismatch sorts of fears. But nevertheless, at one point in human history, it may well have been naturally selected, even though it's useless. And not just useless, it can be positively adverse in modern life. And certainly fear of strangers would be another example of that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, my mum was very strange. She taught me to say hello to strangers, and that was
Oh,
very different to what my peers were being told to
yeah.
do. And yeah, the stranger danger is an interesting one in very porous, permeable social groups, because if you were raised in a small group where you didn't encounter strangers very often, they were unfamiliar. Whereas strangers in our life nowadays
Yeah.
we're constantly encountering strangers.
But for millions of years of human evolution, if you encountered a stranger, that person was probably up to no good.
Yeah, what were they doing out of their area? Yeah.
Right.
You mentioned the book, and the fastest way for me to get a copy of your book was to download an ebook copy from my library. But I heard you flicking through some paper, some pages just next to you. What's normal? Reconciling Biology and Culture by Allan Horwitz. And what was the greatest joy about writing this book for you?
Well, I think it was an exploring topics that I had never thought about before, much less knew anything about them. Courage and cowardice, obesity, first names, which we haven't talked about, but patterns of names which have no biological component whatsoever, but as an example of 100% cultural influence. So that was just discovering all of these new areas and trying to put them together under a single theoretical framework.
And did the book come before you started teaching on this topic, or were you teaching on this topic and then wrote the book?
Once I got an interest in the more general aspects of normality and abnormality, I did design a course. And while I was teaching the course, I was simultaneously writing the book.
What was one of the best parts about teaching about this topic?
Oh, it's just so interesting. I mean, now I found I used to teach very large classes, and that to hold student attention, you had to show video clips. So I could show just fascinating kinds of videos, because I mean, what's more interesting than normality and abnormality if you're a 19-year-old college student? So some of the things we've talked about, I mean, when you go through a Vietnamese food market and see what's for sale and all these truly would be disgusting to 100% of people who are in the class, including myself, but that people love to eat. Or seeing stories about married brothers and sisters who had no idea they were brother and sister when they got married.
Let me ask a question which is very much about gauging where we are at today in terms of thinking about normality. What questions do you think we should ask about normality?
Yeah, I think now we're in a historically totally unique situation where it's probably easier to change biologically rooted phenomena than it is to change culturally rooted phenomena. That cultural norms are very deeply embedded and difficult to change, whereas now through surgeries, we can change someone's sex, we can restore a deaf person's hearing, we can have previously infertile people have biologically related children. I mean, there's just all of these things. Our ability to change biology now is perhaps greater than our ability to change culture. That's never been remotely the case in any previous historical era.
I find that frightening.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, it's frightening because some of the biggest changes we need to make are cultural, and yet we not just seduced but dependent on technological innovation to solve the problems that we have created culturally. This cultural dependence on fossil fuels, this cultural dependence on plastics, this cultural dependence on substances and materials that are not healthy for the planet. What has become normal for humans is not normal for the planet in terms of its current ecology.
Yeah.
And I personally find it frightening when we think that technological innovations will save us, when 2020 has shown us that actually we need to make cultural changes, and we need to make them very fast. I'm here in Australia, and lockdown has been a very successful measure, but that's a cultural measure. That's not really a technological innovation. Technology has made lockdown much easier, I'm able to Zoom
Yeah, right.
Allan Horwitz over at Rutgers University.
Hopefully, we will have mass distribution of a vaccine soon, although we'll see if there's going to be a lot of human resistance to that.
Yeah, yeah. But then here we are again. It's very interesting that this zoonotic disease, which came from pangolins through bats to humans through high population animal trade, really,
Yeah.
which is not new. We've had that with avian influenza and industrial chicken farming, with swine flu and industrial level pig farming. So, this zoonotic disease that gave rise to COVID-19, the solution there is not, oh, well, maybe we should tackle the human trade in other animals. The solution there is, let's find a technological band-aid. Let's find a vaccine. And, I'm so grateful that there's a vaccine. I'm so grateful that we're able to roll this out to, in the first instance, the most vulnerable populations, hopefully. But by having the technological band-aid, I'm worried that we'll leave the cultural changes that we need to make by the wayside. We've dropped carbon emissions dramatically in 2020, thanks to people traveling less and staying home more. But that still is not enough to mitigate the worst effects of the carbon emissions that we've already put into the atmosphere. But what questions should we be asking about this? What questions should we be asking about normality?
In my opinion, the most interesting questions are in the interactions that are just tremendously variable across different topics between social and cultural dynamics and biological and technological dynamics. Whether it's climate change would be a good example where we have to take into account both of those things to develop any kind of effective response. COVID, again, that we need to see how the biological and social interactions and just about all of the phenomena I looked at in the book are really are trying to illustrate different kinds of social and biological, the different ways that they fit together or don't fit together, and what the consequences are.
Professor Allan Horwitz, it has been really thought-provoking to talk with you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. It's been fun.
And thank you for tuning in to Idioms of Normality. I'm your host, Paul Mason, brought to you by Traces.Dreams and Future Framed TV.